right, wrong, indifferent, Joint Commission surveyors don't care, other surveyors don't care. And CMS does this too. I actually was in an organization, we trained 18 Illinois State CMS surveyors, right? And they were told if their policy says this, they better be doing it. So if you're going to put ST 108 into a policy, you better have gotten your senior management to have vetted that you're going to follow ST 108, that you have the resources to follow 108, and you have the backing to actually implement it.
Infection stops where information starts. Welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast, where knowledge is your strongest defense. Broadcasting from the front lines of healthcare, we dive into the strategies, science, and stories shaping infection prevention today. Each episode, we connect you with experts on real-world insights to help you stop the spread of healthcare-associated infections, protect patients, and strengthen your practices as an infection prevention and public health expert. When the right information reaches the right people, lives are saved.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett, Hollembeak, Editor-in-Chief, and today we're joined by our co-host Jill Holdsworth and a special guest, Sylvia Garcia-Houchins, to talk about the ins and outs of when is something a rule, when is it a regulation, and when is it just a recommendation. And for infection preventionists out there, how do we know the difference? We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsors.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollembeak, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Jill Holdsworth. How are you, Jill?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me, as always, Garrett.
Yeah. I had a neat experience earlier today of being on the Power Supply podcast, so our sister brand for supply chain. And those guys might be a lot more rowdy and fun than we are.
No way.
So I'm going to have to I know, it was like being on Shock Jock Radio. So
you're saying we need to step up our game a little bit? Because
I think we do.
That
we need
like
some
challenge.
Yeah, we need some like zany sound effects during the podcast, I think. So, but that said, we have a very exciting guest, Sylvia Garcia-Houchins, today to talk about the difference between recommendations and requirements when it comes to a Joint Commission or any other type of survey that your facility is going through. And this whole season has been about rethinking and achieving that perfect quote-unquote survey. So, Sylvia, thank you for being on the podcast today. We're excited to have you.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. Excited to see Jill again, too.
Oh, thank you. Excited to have you.
Yeah.
So, Sylvia, for those in the audience that don't know you and your career and your contributions to the infection prevention space, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an infection preventionist with over, 37 years of experience. Been doing this a long time. I'm an ex-director of infection prevention and control at a large academic medical center. And I've also worked for JCR, the consulting arm of the Joint Commission, as an infection preventionist. Up until October of 2023, I was the director of infection prevention and control for the Joint Commission. Since then, I've been doing some wild consulting on all kinds of stuff. So it's been pretty exciting.
I love it. So we really...
I got to add to that, Garrett.
Oh, yeah.
I got to add to that, right? This is for you, Jill. My original background, I was a microbiologist.
Yes, I love hearing those kinds of backgrounds. That's amazing. And to add to that, you've had a successful career as a non-traditional background, we'll call it. So I love it. Thank you for adding.
But I also am a nurse now.
Awesome.
Wow. So I'm an infection preventionist who has a micro background, started doing infection control in 1986. In 2008, I got my nursing degree, trying to figure out why nurses weren't washing their hands. That's really why I went to school. I wanted to know why you weren't washing your hands. And I know now why, I think. And then I also got an MBA, which to get that business side on it.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, I think if you get 2 or 3 more degrees, they just give you one for free, right?
I'm hoping. Wouldn't that be nice?
Card. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go a little bit off of our topic today. And did you figure out why nurses don't wash their hands? Because I think that's the bane of every IP's existence.
You know what? Until you are in the position of a nurse, you don't realize what's going on. And I remember it was my first solo patient. I was doing a wound dressing. I was all ready. I had all my supplies. I had my gloves on. I had positioned the patient. I had explained that I had done this in school. I had done this with my preceptor, but this was my first one, and that I was a little bit nervous, that I knew what I was doing. Everything's going to be okay, right? And I got ready to do it and realized, oh my gosh, I forgot the new dressing that I needed, right? And so I'm like, and I forgot something. Just keep where you are. We're all good. And I went running out the door with my gloves on. And I got halfway down the hall and I looked down my hands and I'm like, oh my God, I'm a nurse.
That's a moment.
It was just like this paradigm shift, like, oh my God, I get it. You're in a hurry and you just like totally are one track mind. And I took the gloves off and I looked around at people and I'm like, did anybody notice? Because they all knew I was director of infection control because I was doing an extra shift. I'm like, oh crud, I've been caught. But you really do learn. You really like get that paradigm shift of you're just enmeshed in what's happening with the patient and trying to do the best thing.
I love that. I think that is a really valuable thing for all of us as IPs to hear, that while we are right at the front line, we are not always patient facing, and we're not always in that mode of, get it done. And then you have 8 more patients to take care of that day. It's a lot.
I think that's why it's so important for IPs to get out there and not just audit and watch, but even just shadow some of these positions and really, walk with the nurses, walk with the wound care nurses and see how crazy it can be. Because when you really feel it, you feel the pressure and you feel how quick things have to happen, you suddenly realize like, okay, this is actually really hard. I think back sometimes when I was doing cardiac rehab and we would have a line of people that needed their blood sugar taken before they started their rehab. And I won't tell you if we did or didn't wipe off the glucometer in between or change our gloves or wash our hands or, all the things you're supposed to do. But now, thinking back to that, I'm like, oh my gosh, if an IP had walked in, they would have docked us for everything that you were supposed to be doing.
And so that's so right. It's that moment, that paradigm shift when you realize, oh my gosh, there's more than just infection control happening here.
Right. Yeah. There's so many different competing priorities. And as an IP, you have to try to understand that and really put yourself in the shoes of the other person. But yes, we're thinking about safety and regulatory. I know that's what we're focusing on in this session. But as an IP, even though our one-track mind is IP, we really have to understand everything that these team members are going through and all the different things that are being pushed on them every single day. And you have to make sure you're documenting this and you have to make sure you're doing this every 15 minutes. And there's just so many things they have to remember. It is nearly impossible to be compliant with everything these days.
It is. And that actually segues really well into kind of the theme today, is that paradigm shift of, is it a requirement or is it a recommendation when it comes to survey readiness? And so that's the first question we wanted to throw out to you, Sylvia, is how do we know when something is a requirement or when it is just just a best practice recommendation?
So, this is something that infection preventionists across the country struggle with, right? And so you have to go back a step and really look at the terminology. Requirements, when you think requirements for IPs, you need to think about, is there a law that says I have to do this? Or does that law and direct a certain course of action? Or has that law adopted a recommendation, which has now made it a requirement, right? And so it's really differentiating between what is legally required and what's best practice. And many IPs blur those lines.
Sylvia, do you think that you could define what makes a best practice a best practice? Because I do hear those two words just thrown around all the time, like, well, it's best practice. Well, what made that a best practice? Or, why are you saying it's best practice? Because you just want it to be? So what would you say makes a best practice so?
Okay, so a lot of times, again, it's based on that terminology, right? So if I told you the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard as an IP, you would say, oh, I got to do that. It's a standard, right? But all the time we have other people who are saying, oh, well, there's the this standard or the that standard. And they're thinking that it's the same thing as the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard, which is a law, right? And they're taking something that's got the name standard, and it's really not a standard, it's a best practice. So let me give you an example, right? So I know this is controversial, the whole ST108, right? ST108 has become very controversial in the IP community. And so is that a requirement or is that a recommendation? Is it a best practice? Well, if your instruments are looking quite grungy and they've got surface corrosion on them and they've got staining and there's some problem with your instruments as a result of the process, and you find out that, it's happening because of the water, well, then ST108 is a best practice that you probably need to follow. But it's a best practice, right? It's not a requirement that you follow it. And we have a lot of those things that are best practices, right? When we look at the bundles, the CLABSI and the CAUTI bundles, which we all are like, yeah, you got to follow the bundle. But why is it not a requirement versus it is a best practice? Well, it's only a requirement if a law says we have to, or your accrediting body says you have to. So, and other than that, I can choose. And so the best practice is I follow the bundle. But maybe part of that bundle doesn't make sense. And so I get to choose the parts I want to do rather than saying I got to implement it all. So that's where we get into that. It's a best practice to follow them all, but I can't possibly do that here. I might do ST108, right? But if the best practices have a pH, and I'm making it up because I don't know what it is. It's the pH is 6.7, but I can only get to 6.5. Have I failed because I haven't gotten to 6.7? That 0.2 doesn't make a difference, right? That's that. Which one is it a best practice? Yeah, but do I have to do it? No.
Do you have any advice for IPs on how they can do that choosing, the picking and choosing?
Yeah, so you always have to start with the laws. You have to know what the basic requirements for where you are practicing is, right? So every organization across this country is different. You all have to meet, every IP has to meet federal law. So what are the federal laws we have to meet from an infection control standpoint? Well, we have to meet FDA rules and regulations. We have to meet EPA rules and regulations. We need to meet OSHA's rules and regulations, like the bloodborne pathogen standard and the PPE standard. Right? Those are laws. And so knowing which laws apply on the federal level is important. But then we have state laws. Right? So depending on what state we're in, if you are in New Jersey, you have to follow ST79 for sterilization. And you have to follow SGNA for your scopes. Okay, so now I've added to the laws. And then if you're a deemed organization, meaning you're getting Medicare or Medicaid funding, well, then you have to follow all the laws and the rules from CMS. So now I have to follow the state operations manual, right? So I've got a group that's that core things that I have to follow as an IP. That's where you start. Then you start adding in what else is required. And so back in 2019, I put out something called the Standard Approach to Infection Control for the Joint Commission. It's in Perspectives, April 2019. Really important for infection preventionists. Start with the law. You go to CMS, or if you're military, directives, right? If you're VA directives, and then you go to those manufacturer's instructions, and that's where the FDA gets pulled in. Did we follow the rules there, right? And then from there, now we got guidelines and consensus documents, and those are our choices unless somebody has made the choice for us, right? That's New Jersey with their ST79. If somebody's made that choice, then we got to incorporate that too. But as an IP, you have to know the source of the rules and then be able to say, oh, that one doesn't apply. That's just the best practice, and I get to choose.
I think that's a really reasonable breakdown of that. And that's especially bringing in AAMI standards to it, because you'll hear folks say sometimes, well, it's in ST79 or 91. And it's like, well, we also need to look at that should, shall, must, which pieces are requirements, which pieces are recommendations. Because just because it says it in there doesn't mean everything is lined out as a have to, shall, One question I had for you bringing in the FDA piece is, how does that math change when, let's say, an instrument manufacturer starts to put in their IFUs, their instructions for use? You should comply with ST108. Does that then become a requirement because they put that line in an IFU?
Technically, yes. They're telling you have to follow ST79, ST91, ST58, whatever it is, right? So they've decided this is what you need to do. A good example is Halyard, right? In their sterilization wrap. They have some really nice videos on how to wrap, but what else do? They say, we recommend you follow the wrapping that is provided in ST79. So what's your surveyor going to do? They're going to go to ST79 and say, well, this is what it says to do here. They've given you something which you should be following. Again, let's go back to those words, right? Recommend. As the manufacturer, they say, we recommend. How do I read that as? We're telling you to do this, right? So that also pulls in the law again, right? Why does it pull in the law? Well, when somebody has an adverse event and you get sued, or your organization gets sued, and sometimes they actually name you, right? Did you follow the rules? Did you follow what was the requirements versus the recommendations? The first thing the lawyer is going to say is, did you follow all the requirements? Right? Then they're going to ask you, did you follow the best practices? Or did you meet the standard of care? So it's really important to start with, what are the requirements and did I follow them? And then add to it. And that's where we sort of go off the rails sometimes at ISPs. We say, oh, but everybody's doing this, I want to do it too. And we forget about, that actually goes against the requirements of my state, or that goes against the requirements of some other regulatory body. So got to be careful about that. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, and now just kind of going back, and I know what you're going to say the answer to this, but just to remind people, if you get really excited about something like ST108 and you're going to say, like, I want to make my facility follow ST108, so I'm going to put it in my policy that we're going to follow ST108 and we're requiring our facility to follow ST108. What are your thoughts about that, and what do you caution people about doing something like that?
So the first thing that pops into my head is something that one of my colleagues at the Joint Commission said. And I want to say he said 65 or 85. It's a 5. It's a really high number. Of the findings that the Joint Commission does is based on a facility policy. Right, wrong, indifferent. Joint Commission surveyors don't care. Other surveyors don't care. And CMS does this too. I actually was in an organization, we trained 18 Illinois State CMS surveyors, right? And they were told, if their policy says this, they better be doing it. So if you're going to put ST108 into a policy, you better have gotten your senior management to have vetted that you are going to have, that you're going to follow ST108, that you have the resources to follow 108, and you have the backing to actually implement it. Because this happens all the time. IPs write things into policies as requirements. It's policy, it's a requirement. And the surveyor comes in, and the next thing you know, and it's happened. I have an IP on the phone with the Joint Commission crying, saying, but I didn't really mean to put that in the policy. And I'm like, but you did.
But you did.
So you get scored. Yeah. You get scored, and your response is going to be, we realized we didn't follow a methodology to come up with our policy, and we're going to change our policy to meet how the Joint Commission says we should do this. And so we're going to change our policy, and we're not going to put this in here. And that's okay.
So I can already feel my own wheels turning, and I'm sure our audience too, of do we get any leeway if we say, let's say we put in our policy, staff should ABC, whatever it is, hand hygiene, IFU, not really IFU compliance, but if we put that our policy recommends something, does that give wiggle room, or should policies be prescriptive to the standard?
You got to be really careful here, right? So if you have an overarching document, and we used to call it the policy for the policy at my organization, right? The policy for the policy pretty much set up what the hierarchy of the policies, right? Overarching administrative policies. Then under that, safety infection control policies, and then under that, departmental policies. And you can't ever write a policy at the department level that violates the infection control or the safety policy or the administrative policy. Infection control can never write something that violates the administrative policy or the safety policy. And so the same thing would be with wording, right? If you define in your policy what we mean by the word shall, should, must, then you get to go hash it out with somebody if somebody catches you, right? A surveyor can't say, no, it means an all or none. No, this is how we wrote our policy. This is where we're going to define it. However, the most important thing about policies is can your workers, can the people who work for your organization follow them? And so if they have to go to the Cliff Notes section to figure out, well, this says shall and this says should, and maybe I should do this, and you could do that, then it's probably not the best policy. So what I tell people is you don't have to have a policy for everything, but the policies you have should be well thought out. They should follow the rules, right? Is there a law and regulation? Does CMS say I have to do this? Do the manufacturer's instructions say I have to do this, or do they prohibit this? And what evidence-based guidelines or consensus statements have I chosen to follow? Because if you didn't follow that, if you can't look at your policies and say, yeah, that makes it, then you're probably going to end up with a problem somewhere down the line.
I like those insights too, because I think we sometimes get in the habit of thinking if it's in a policy, we almost put the cart before the horse and say, if I write it into a policy, they'll have to do it.
Or it'll just happen. Like it'll magically happen.
Or it'll just happen.
Magic.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows if you put it in black and white in the policy, everybody will comply.
So let me give you two examples, Garrett. I'm going to jump in here and give you two examples that I want everybody across the country to know. You do not have to have 1/4 inch nails. And you do not have to have 1/8 inch nails. So CDC made it a 2 recommendation. It's not a 1A, 1B, 1C recommendation. It's a 2. There's no real proof that it's from an infection control standpoint, it makes a difference. And so you don't have to do it, right? And you don't have to have 1/8 because AORN is guidance. It's a guideline. You get to choose. Yet of all the things I saw most frequently scored, it's something easy for a surveyor to walk down the hall and look at somebody and say, wow, those nails are long. Let me see your policy. And they get scored, right? Here's another one that I got a question this week from a friend who said, hey, do they have to wash their hands when they're passing trays? Did you know there's an FAQ on the Joint Commission website? It basically says the Joint Commission is not prescriptive, that it's a level 2 recommendation. If you're not touching the patient, but if you're touching the patient's environment, it's a level 2 as to whether or not you have to wash your hands or do hand hygiene. Now, as an IP, I want you to wash your hands if you come into my room or go out of my room, right? But from a policy standpoint, you would be perfectly okay to write a policy that does not require the tray passer to wash their hands every time they go in and out of a room, because there's no requirement.
Can you shed a little bit more light on what that level 2 is? That piece is?
So many IPs, especially the newer IPs, haven't been around. I was in the trenches, right, when CDC guidelines were actually being written. Isn't that scary, right? When they were actually developing them. And so the first thing we read about them was there's different levels of recommendation for CDC. 1A, 1B, 1C, and 2. 1A and 1B are you have evidence to say this is what you should do. And that's why we're making that recommendation. 1C is there's a regulatory requirement to do whatever they're saying. And you be careful there, because I actually found one that CDC misquoted. So always double check CDC or anybody else who's telling you it's a law. And then there's level 2, which, theoretically, it should make a difference. It should keep everybody safe. But there's no evidence there, right? So there's no scientific evidence that having the tray passer wash their hands every time they drop off a tray is going to make a difference to patient safety, which it isn't there. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that there's different levels of evidence. And, we talk about the standards of care, best practice, evidence-based guidelines, that we're all following evidence-based guidelines. But I'm going to tell you a little secret about evidence-based guidelines. My friend, Gina Puglisi, who's since left us, who was my most wonderful mentor, I once asked her, she wrote an article in Bennett and Brockman, which is hospital infections, IPs. If you've been an IP for a long time, you know this book, right? And she wrote the linen chapter. And I said, Gina, how did you decide they had to change curtains with this frequency? And she looked at me and she's like, well, I did a lot of research. I tried to find a paper. We didn't have the internet back then. I tried to find all the evidence. And she said, honestly, I asked 3 or 4 IPs what they did and I made it up. And we still today change our curtains. It says 6 months, I think, or 3 to 6 months.
And that's another great topic. Nobody really knows what to do. And now some curtain manufacturers are telling you what their IFU is on how often you have to do it. Yeah. Nobody knows.
They're making it up. They're making it up based on my friends making it up. So when we look at things, we need to look at where did it come from? What authority do they have to tell me to do it? And then just like anything else you do in your life, just because someone tells you to do it or says, hey, this is the best thing since sliced bread to do, you got to do your homework and say, does this make sense? What are the implications for the patient if we do or don't do it? And not only that, what are the implications for your organization? We literally have IPs making decisions that commit their organizations. I just heard one, $6 million to do something. $6 million. What does $6 million mean to an organization? It means they're not going to get a new CT scanner, a new MRI, something that's really going to save patients' lives. So IPs need to think about where did it come from? Why am I doing this? That whole part of requirement versus recommendation, I have personal things I want people to do, right? And I would love to make them my agenda, but probably not the best idea to let Sylvia make all the rules. And that's sometimes what happens at organizations.
Literal peek behind the curtain there on that one. That's, I think that's really interesting. And something that IPs can run into is goofing and saying this is a requirement, and it really is just a recommendation. So what advice or feedback would you give to whether it's a new IP or a seasoned IP when you say something is a requirement, but it's a recommendation?
So I've actually been facing this a lot, right? Now that I'm out back in the consulting world, I was in the consulting world for JCR, but now that I'm out in the consulting world and I have the background that I have had senior leadership come to me and say, hey, I think my IP's over their skis on this, or this is going to cost us X amount of money. Is this really a requirement? Right? And I'm left going, oh, I don't want to throw this IP under the bus, right? Now, how do I handle this, right? So I always do hey, there's a lot of ways to approach things, and there's rules and regulations of what you do, and there's quote unquote standards of practice, right? Like there's no one that tells you have to have enough staff to reprocess those endoscopes based on the amount of time it's going to take you to reprocess those endoscopes. But come on, the standard of practice is to have enough staff to reprocess the endoscopes, following the instructions for use and doing all the steps, right? And then there's the things that are nice to do, wonderful to do, good evidence to do. And I I talk about that, and then I talk about their IP and how their IP really wants to do the best possible job for them and to protect patients and their organization. So I always say, can we get the IP involved in this conversation? Because there's always more than one side of the story. So I really think the IPs really need to take a step back when someone's questioning them and say, that's a great question. I need to do more. Let me go do a little more research. I know my fellow IPs are doing this, but, let me make sure that this is really founded on what I think it is and take a step back and do this. That sort of opens the door and says, no one's perfect. Let me take a look. And I think that's the important part here, especially, you get in your infection control committee and somebody's like, no. And you're sort of stuck like, okay, maybe I should have done the meeting before the meeting, but I didn't. So now what am I doing? That's when you take that step back and say, that's a great question. Let me look into it. Or, and I had this happen I actually had an IP do this. She's like, oh my God, we just rolled out our new policy and told everybody they couldn't have these nails. And now I'm going to turn around and that this was the worst thing they could do for patients and blah, blah, blah. And now I'm going to turn around and tell them we changed the policy because we don't want to get Joint Commission all mad at us, right? And I'm like, okay, so let's take a step back. How do we handle that? You just told everybody about the nails. Okay. You can always say, you know what? This was really hard for us to implement. And we're getting feedback that it's not practical. And, you all are complaining, the managers are complaining. So we took a step back and we actually looked at where did this come from? And, we had a surveyor who surveyed us and scored us for this 3 surveys ago. And so we've done this because of that. But now we're finding out, there's some leeway here. And so here's what we found out. But by the way, there are some articles about here's the danger. So we want to give you the information. And at the same time, we're finding there isn't information about this part of their policy. We're going to tweak that a little bit, make it better for everybody. So sort of that, we had some feedback. We need to compromise. It's a good way to save face, right? Hopefully you've done that before you implemented this policy or wrote this policy, but that's not always possible, right? And none of us is perfect. I've had to do it. I've had to go into a room and say, okay, guys, I screwed up. I thought this was a requirement, and it wasn't. And the good news is we know what the requirement, and it's going to be a lot easier. Or I've gone into a room and say, you know what, this isn't a requirement, but I read the literature about this, and I'm sorry, but here's all the literature. I'm going to go through it, and here's the 4 people who died because we didn't. They decided not to do it. And so I'm going to appeal to your higher level. This isn't a just practice. This is what's safer to patients, and I have the evidence to prove it. So let me get at it. I think it's really important.
I would agree 100%. And that's the kind of nuanced approach that can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. We want things all black and white, but, IPs we have to approach it with a scientific mind and understand that there's going to be nuance and gray area and times where we change our directive based on new data. When it comes to you're in a survey and you have to speak to this nuance, how can IPs be clear and credible when they're going through a perfect survey?
Or an imperfect survey, yeah. Right? Because usually the IP isn't getting called in unless there's a problem. Explain this to the surveyor, or the surveyor wants to know, right? Part of that is having that all lined up. So the surveyors, at least while I was there, were being trained on that approach to infection control, right? So explaining to the surveyor of, here's what you saw, and no one's disagreeing with what you saw, but here's the rules that apply. Here's the law and regulation that applies. Here's CMS. CMS interpretive guidance says I get to choose my guidelines. It's not an all or none. So I've chosen here, and based on what we've chosen as an organization, it's not a shall, it's a could. So we've considered this, and here's the implications if we did that. And so we've decided not to do that, because it's not in the best interest of our organization or our patients, right? So following that approach, that linear approach with the surveyor to show them how you got there is very important. There's some things that you can't explain your way out of. If you didn't follow the law, it ain't going to happen. if you did not follow a CMS requirement, so this is where I tell y'all, go to the state operation manual, Google it, CMS state operation manual, go to the infection control section, read it and read the interpretive guidance, and then Control F, put it in infection control and find all the other stuff because it's all over the place. That's where you need to start. Yeah, and if you don't start there, then you don't know the requirements.
I love it. And one more time, that resource for IPs to go to.
And they just put in CMS, State Operations Manual. That is what all of your state surveyors are using as their quote unquote Bible. And if you've been reading anything about the Joint Commission, they put out an announcement June 30th that they are updating their standards. And what they are really doing is saying we as a deeming organization need to follow CMS. And so they are now making their standards publicly available online, because that's sometimes a problem. Infection prevention has never seen the standards, right? So they can get them online and they will get the interpretive guidance. What is your surveyor being told to do and how do they survey this is actually in the state operations manual.
And thanks for making that link. There's been a lot of chatter since that announcement was made about what does this mean? How does this impact us? And what do we do now? And so that's great advice to go and check that out and really understand what this means for everybody.
Yeah, it's a little, I think people are feeling very uncomfortable in the space. And I don't think they realize accrediting organizations, DNV, AAAHC, Joint Commission are accrediting organizations. They are supposed to be making sure you follow the CMS conditions for coverage, conditions of participation, nursing home rules. That is their primary role. And anything else that they add, your organization has chosen to do by choosing that accrediting organization. Right? So it really behooves any IP to read that state operations manual. Then there's no surprises.
That's what we like. We don't like surprises with a survey. I think that's one of the big themes and takeaways is go to the source of truth and be familiar with it.
And don't become the source of truth for your organization by writing a policy that says something completely different. Because ultimately, the source of truth for your surveyor is your policies. No matter what else happens, right? They're going to make sure you follow the law. They're going to make sure you follow CMS. They're going to look at those manufacturer instructions. But if you wrote something in your policy for them, that is the source of truth. So they have to score you, no matter who they are, against your policies as well. That makes it really hard when you wrote policies. Or you borrowed a policy and you didn't read it.
Yes, I think that happens maybe all too often that, hey, this worked for my previous organization. We're going to slap a new hospital name on it and assume it works. So, Sylvia, as we close this out today, what are a couple of go and do things that IPs listening today can go and implement in their own facility to be more nuanced and provide better education on that source of truth?
Okay, so the first thing I would tell you is in the Joint Commission's new IC standards, there is a 12-page assessment tool. If you don't have access to it today, you can go to Joint Commission pre-publication standards and you're looking for the survey process guide. It's published. You don't have to ask anybody for it. That 12-page tool is actually going to tell you what the surveyor should be looking for, and it's going to give you some policy names that you absolutely have to have. Right? So that's going to point you in that direction of what's required. And those that actually mimics what CMS requires too. Right? So homework, please go look at that. Please go look at CMS conditions of participation for infection control. And they're really nondescript. The important part is the interpretive guidance and the survey process. And the other place you need to look for CMS is they're called survey and certification memos that clarify things. Google CMS, survey and certification memos, and you will get a whole list of things that you need to do. Those are the basic rules that everybody's got to follow, right? From a a holistic place. But the other place you need to go to is your administrative code for your state. So what I always do is administrative code infection, or I put it infection control rules and the state that I'm going to be surveying in, and up pops all the rules.
That's excellent. The practicality of just going and doing the legwork, the mental legwork of being familiar with these processes, being familiar with these really concrete guidance that is already out there. I think that's going to relieve IPs of a lot of heartburn. We think about going into a survey and doing what's best for the patient as an outcome of it. So I want to thank you very much for all of the insights and expertise that you gave us today, and also for the homework, because I think every IP
Yes.
listening to this is going to be writing notes furiously to what can I read, what can I learn to make this a reality in my facility. So thank you very much.
Can I add one more tip?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're having your survey tomorrow, and the surveyor says, I want to see the policy for this, and you get it out and you look at it and you go, oh my God, this is way over what the requirement is. Say, we had a policy, it's in revision.
There we go.
Right? Just a little tip. Don't give them a policy that's going to hang you.
I love it. That is great advice. We might have to use that. Well, thank you again, and we appreciate all of your contributions to infection prevention.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, that was a really fun episode. I love talking with Sylvia. She is somebody that if she's speaking, I stop and I listen because she is so full of knowledge and expertise. One of the things that I have really taken from her over and over is learning about consensus documents versus requirements. That's something that a lot of people get confused, and it really is something important to understand what is the difference between the two things.
Mm-hmm. And the points you made about how you write a policy in a way that isn't going to get you in trouble, I thought that was a shocking stat of how many citations are related to the way the facility's own policy is written. So a huge takeaway for the IPs out there listening. We want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode of the Transmission Control Podcast. And remember, infection stops where information starts.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.